Support this podcast at patreon.com/Kris Karl Photography Podcast. To start off with, we always like to frame how it is that people first ended up picking up a camera. So what's the story behind you picking up a camera for the first time?
I guess is the question, the first time I picked up a photography camera or a cinema camera?
Whichever came first, I guess.
Then I guess it would be a video camera, right? I think like a lot of people, our generation growing up in the 80s and early 90s was just so taken with Spielberg films, and Mission Impossible was a big one, Jurassic Park, Back to the Future, all those really exciting movies for kids and adults. I mean, I still love those movies. I think I was really drawn to creating your own world through a lens. My dad, I think it was my dad. My parents were separated, but my dad had a cheesy little camera that we would spend the entire weekend just recreating scenes from films that we loved, and really just took a liking to that. And it was, I found myself kind of always behind the camera and directing my brothers and my cousins, and just really enjoyed trying to tell a story even at that young age, or recreate a story. And just kind of, from there, it just kind of blossomed into I want to keep doing this as long as I can.
Well, a lot of people that start off with a keen interest in film from an early age want to grow up to be like the actor or actress that in their favorite movie. What was it that made you want to actually make the film rather than star in the film?
I think early on it happened out of necessity. I think no one else really wanted to be behind the camera. Like you said, everyone wants to be in front of it. So out of necessity, I kind of became the one that took control of the image. It wasn't until later when I was in college for film that I really felt like I've made the right choice. I think I think that it's such a competitive field to even get into film, but to be an actor, I live in Los Angeles, and it's just every fourth person you meet is an actor. I think I think that there's something really special about being able to see someone through a lens. I think photographers understand this too. I think there's a lot of empathy that goes along with seeing someone cross your lens. You can kind of understand a person a little bit better when you're looking at them that way. And so I think I really became attracted to that element of it later on as I just got as I got older and more involved in filmmaking.
So to those that don't know, obviously this is primarily a photography podcast, but there's obviously a lot of overlap in recent years with photography people going over to do video stuff, I guess, for like YouTube or whatnot, as video features more and more in photography cameras. But what is a cinematographer?
A cinematographer how do you boil that down to one answer? I guess a cinematographer is the person on set who's in control of the visuals. So, you have your director who kind of has the vision and the idea and the story in mind. And really the cinematographer's job is to take that vision and take those ideas and those story elements and paint with light and really do the best that they can to execute that for the director. So I also think like in a way you're sort of the lead person in charge of the crew members. I think a lot of, you have your electric department, and you have your grip department, and you have sound department and production, and everyone it kind of all funnels up, and you talk to the cinematographer, and then the cinematographer, is kind of a voice for the entire crew. And then you have, director. And so there's a lot of communication between the two of those roles, I think.
What's harder to get used to, the language of the sort of the communication of getting someone's idea out of their head and then so it's visually able to be seen by everybody? Or is it just the technical side of things and actually learning the use of the camera, the use of lighting and so on? Which one's harder?
I think it's harder to communicate between someone, especially when you're talking big picture ideas. I think the wonderful thing about filmmaking is it's so collaborative. So you're often, as a cinematographer, I'm often with a camera department. So I've got a first AC and a second AC. And if it's a nice budget, I've got a DIT and I've got maybe a focus puller or something like that. So there's a lot of people on my small team that are, they know every in and out and every button of every camera that's ever been released. So that they're just kind of there for technical support. So you're never flying alone there. I do think though that the communication, that takes practice. I think you really do have to work on it. And I think that's why you end up working with people more than once. I think those relationships are valuable. Creating a shorthand with a director and understanding his or her vision and kind of knowing, the history that you have together and going, yeah, so this person, when they say this word, I think that what they mean is this. So just having that shorthand, I think, is so important. But it takes time. It takes time to build that understanding, and that's kind of where the job gets difficult for me. Is just making sure I'm really listening and understanding what they're wanting, and then trying to communicate it back to them so that they go, yes, that I agree with that.
Do you ever run into issues where the communication's just not lining up and maybe they're not making themselves clear or anything like that?
Always. Always. I do. Actually, I have been doing a little bit more directing and DPing. So I do find that happens often with ad agencies or clients. A lot of times because it's not necessary, they don't really know how to express what they're wanting visually. So it is a lot of, we're guessing, we're using our own idea of what they're saying and kind of pitching that to them. And then we kind of massage it out together. I think that's pretty normal. And especially for people that are coming from that side of it, they don't necessarily have to have the vision all the time and know how to communicate it. I think that's when it falls on us to go, yeah, okay, I see what you're trying to say. Let me see if this works.
Well, that's always going to be the hard part, right? Is everyone has their own language, I guess, for the job that they're doing. And it's just finding a way to translate even between two people that can speak literally the same prime language, but they have different words and different ways of expressing the idea that they've got. That's going to be the main run-in, I'd imagine. One of the big differences with photography and motion or any kind of cinematography, any kind of like commercial work or really anything that I see, one of the big differences I see is that photography seems to be quite a solo performance, whereas cinematography appears to be very much reliant on collaboration and multiple parties kind of working together. One thing I'd never understood, and I'd be fascinated to hear how this is done, is if you're someone that wants to become a cinematographer, but you don't have access to that huge number of people and that production, how do you go about creating a reel and doing personal work?
That's a good question. So I think for me personally, it did require a lot of me going out and shooting on my own. It took me a number of years before I could even hire crew or be hired onto a crew to kind of learn that collaborative process. So for very early on in my career, I just thought, oh, this is how we do it. I just have to do everything on my own. And then I started to create a bubble, and then it's hard to understand, asking for help or asking for someone to pull focus. Then suddenly, am I doing it wrong then if I need the help? And
right.
So I think, so I think that early on, it is a lot of, it is very isolating. Like you said, with photography, you're basically doing the same thing. You're kind of running camera, you're directing, you're asking questions if it's an interview. and then you're taking it home and you're editing it, and then you really have no one to bounce it off of other than your client. So very, very similar, I think, early on. I think it's that isolation process, and then eventually maybe people start to take notice, and then you can offer your skills to a broader range of people.
Is it ever a struggle for you when someone's giving you direction and you kind of know that it's not doing the best of what could be done with the idea, and you want to take it in a different sort of direction creatively, but you kind of have to follow what you're being told by that director? Is that ever something that really frustrates you?
Yeah, that can definitely be frustrating. Kind of dealt with that a little bit earlier in my career too. I think that might have been more my ego trying to take control. What I have found in more recent years is oftentimes if I'm really dreading having to do this idea, or I think that it should be a different way, usually I can find a way to try it the way that is suggested and then offer a different approach. And oftentimes what ends up happening is we find a compromise between the two. I think, again, it goes back to that communication between you and your collaborators. If there's a trust there, I think you trust that this person, even though you don't necessarily see what they're talking about yet, maybe it's somewhere between what you're thinking and vice versa.
So as a cinematographer, how does photography factor into your life? Is it something you just do in your spare time?
Yeah, so photography is really just a hobby for me. Oftentimes for when I'm shooting a job, we'll go do a scout where we go look at the locations and just kind of see what the light is doing and how can we figure out which way the light is motivated. And that kind of informs all of our decisions in terms of what gear we're going to be bringing and what lights we need. And so when we do those scouts, I always bring my camera because I think that you really want to be able to, you can obviously look by eye and you can go, okay, yeah, I can see that the sun's mostly coming from the right side of frame for most of the day. And, but really to look at it and understand it, I think it's better to look at it through a lens. Right. So I really bring that camera everywhere. And then it started to follow me on day trips. And then it started following me to events. And it just kind of became a hobby that has taken over my life in a great way, because it kind of works as a way to flex those creative muscles, even when I'm not working. And I think it's a positive thing. I think it's good to kind of be always looking at images and understanding light and how it works. And I feel like I'm always chasing like naturalistic light and natural movement of people. And I think shooting photography and especially candid shots, I think really helps to understand those two ideas.
Is it something where you can see something in a still image that you can translate into your cinematography or vice versa, and that you're able to kind of feed off yourself in that way for inspiration?
Yeah, definitely. I watch a ton of movies, and I find that sometimes it's great to just pause a movie. If you're just blown away by a shot, just pause a movie and take a screenshot of that, right? And then it becomes a photograph. And then you just kind of study that image and you kind of go, where's our key light coming from? Where's this edge light coming from? Is there any kind of fill? A lot of shadow here. Wonder if that's negative. So you're kind of taking it apart. And I think that that's kind of the beauty of photography is you can kind of just stare at it forever and just wonder about it. And not just technically, but what the story is, what the photographer was thinking, what their intention was, what are the people in the photo thinking, what's their backstory, all these things.
You said you brought your camera along with you everywhere you went. What camera in particular was it? So I started out shooting digitally with a 5D Mark II, I believe, and just a little 50 millimeter lens, which kind of a good lens, especially on
that camera because I think that's a full sensor. So yeah, it's kind of like the perfect, like you can get semi wide, but you can also get some really nice close up portrait work.
And then that evolved into film at some point.
Yeah. So then I got really into film. A few years ago, I saw a movie called Karl, and in the movie, Rooney Mara plays like a young student, and she always has this little film camera with her. And I was like, hey, that looks like fun. That looks a lot lighter than a 5D Mark II. And I decided, well, maybe I should just try it. I mean, it can't be that scary, right? I mean, that was the biggest drawback, was maybe price and the fear of you have to get exposure exactly right, because you don't get to try it 20 times.
Right.
That kind of blossomed, and partner with a good friend of mine, and we kind of go out and shoot all the time. And he kind of got me really into home scanning, which really changes the experience for me. You just have a ton more control over your image at the end of it, rather than leaving it all up to a lab.
Right. And so you're now primarily shooting film, I guess, when you're doing photography. Do you feel like it changed the way that you shoot compared to when you were using digital, other than obviously the size difference in the cameras?
Yeah, definitely. It definitely changed the way I shoot. I approach it very differently now, because it's much more about patience for me. I think I go into an image I go into a scene, and I really think about what I'm wanting out of it, what I'm hoping for. I really pay attention to the light. I'm using my light meter a lot more. It's very similar to being on set for me. And that's kind of an appeal for me, is really sitting there and thinking about things before I just shoot it. That said, I kind of went to, like we all do, I went to one extreme where I then was like, well, not worth it. Not worth taking this photo. What ends up happening is then the roll of film sits in there for like 6 months. So now I'm kind of coming back. The pendulum is swinging back in the opposite direction, which now I'm trying not to be too precious about it. I'm still trying to be very intentional about what I'm shooting, but I'm trying not to be too precious. So why not snap 2 photos of it? We'll see what happens.
If I could just ask an unbelievably stupid question, because I'm an unbelievably stupid person, do you ever find it strange photographing in sort of composing in different aspect ratios between photography and cinematography? Does that ever sort of jar you when you go from one to the other, and you have to change almost your eye for a scene?
No, I think that's a great question. And I often talk about this with other cinematographers. Anamorphic is having like a real resurgence right now. I talk about this with my cinematographer friends. Anamorphic is making this resurgence, that aspect ratio of 2:1 or 2 point. I'm going to mess it up. 2.35:1, I believe, is the other.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Anamorphic. And it's funny, you shoot a project on that, for 3 or 4 days in a row. And then it's suddenly like my eyes, even when I'm not looking through the lens, I'm seeing things anamorphically. It's amazing how much your vision is affected by the aspect ratio that you're looking through. And so right. I think that's a good question, that like it can be jarring jumping back and forth. I think too, like I found that out earlier on, which is I would take, scalp photos, in 2x3. And then the next day we're framing up and I'm 16:9. And then all of a sudden I'm like, wait a second. Yesterday we could see the full roof and now we don't. Now we got to back up 20 feet. So it's definitely jarring. And I think that there are so many aspect ratios to choose from nowadays. I think that it's kind of exciting too. You can really dial in a look and decide, what your story works best. Wes Anderson is really known for this, with his recent films, like switching between different aspect ratios to kind of tell a story differently or present a different tone. So yeah.
I mean, with Anderson, I never noticed it watching the film until it was pointed out to me. Whereas with Christopher Nolan films, it actually at times quite bugs me because I think it's quite noticeable. As great as his films are, I'm not knocking, obviously, his incredible talent, but he's the only one who, when I see it done in his movies, the changing between aspect ratios, it actually sometimes pulls me out of a scene a little bit.
Yeah, I'm trying to think which Christopher Nolan film does that.
Dark Knight does. I'm pretty sure Dark Knight Rises does. I'm sure there are scenes in Dunkirk that shift quite dramatically through where he wants to use an IMAX camera for like the more intense action and then switch back.
That's right.
I think it happens a bit more often than I think. Maybe I'm just a bit of a, as we would say in England, a bit of a twat, and I'm noticing it more than I should do. Let's move on before I upset one of my favorite directors in the world.
Okay.
Let's talk about Las Vegas, one of my most favorite cities in the world. If I could live anywhere, I'd probably move to Vegas. You've done a project around Las Vegas, and I don't want to frame it in any way whatsoever. I'd rather you talk about it, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's always exciting to meet another fan of Las Vegas. It's such a polarizing city for people.
Yeah.
People either hate it or they love it, and maybe they love it for the wrong reasons, or maybe they hate it for the wrong reasons. But I've always had a bizarre fascination with the city. I think it's a city of, I think it's an underdog city. It obviously has the entertainment element and the lights, and it's spectacular to look at. But I think that there's, when you take a look at outside of the Strip, I think you can really start to see that it's different. It's different than what you're presented, and it's in the middle of a desert where it doesn't belong, where there's no water. It's a funky place, and so I've had this bizarre interest in the city, and I had always been wanting to tell a Las Vegas story. So spent a couple of years just kind of throwing ideas back and forth and researching and talking to different people, and finally settled on a story about neon, because the city is just so well known for its neon, and in very Vegas style, it's all disappearing. Nothing's really sacred there. Everything gets torn down and rebuilt, every 10 years. So the remaining neon is so important to kind of hold on to. And so that felt like an important story. So I set out to tell a short documentary about a neon vendor or a neon artist named Tiza, who grew up in Las Vegas, and her mom was a burlesque dancer. So they have this connection to this vintage 60s Las Vegas. And her work is really inspired by her mom. And so we set out to do a 6-minute documentary. It turned into a 25-minute film. And now it's running at film festivals currently. So,
yeah, I feel like Vegas is generally not liked by people that haven't been there, that have just heard about it, or overly liked by people that haven't been there but think that the only thing to do there is to go and get drunk and gamble and kill hookers or whatnot. Whereas actually, like, it's a brilliant hub for anyone that works in any kind of visual art, because you can sleep in a decent hotel, get great food. There's people around, you can enjoy yourself, but you also have access to all these amazing landscapes and these amazing spots. And there's a great history there as well. That's, like you said, it disappears, but you can still dig through and find pieces of it, which I actually just think is really fun. I don't know why Vegas has quite got the reputation it has. I think it's a wonderful place. I don't know if I'd want to be there at the moment, because I think it's about 10 degrees hotter than where I am now, and I'm close to dying as it is.
Right.
I was wondering at what point to ask this particular question, and I was going to leave it towards the end because I thought it was kind of an interesting parallel to draw in a photography podcast. But I also think it might be the stupidest question I have. So I'll probably put it in now, and then it's sandwiched between loads of other stuff and people might forget about it by the end. What do you find harder technically in terms of creativity, whatever? What do you find harder, sort of moving image or still frames? Well, what's harder for you to actually produce work that you're happy with?
Well, really depends on the day, honestly. I think I am drawn to motion. It comes a little bit easier to me. than finding that perfect image. I think a lot, because I think there's a lot of feeling involved with the motion. I think for me, especially, I really am a hands-on operator. I really like, I like camera movement. I really like handheld, in your face. I like to follow people. So I think that is really a great experience for me, but I think it's hard to translate that to photography. That said, the flip side of that, I think, is that sometimes with photography, it's nice to not have a master. Oftentimes when I'm shooting video, it's for someone else. It's a lot of people have to approve it. That handheld that I'm talking about has to be approved by 8 different people. So I think there's a lot of freedom in being able to go out with my camera and just go. It doesn't really matter what happens at the end. There's no outcome with this, or no outcome that I'm aiming for, other than it would be nice to have a nice picture out of this. But I think that can be really freeing. So again, really depends on the day.
So to this point, do you now ever take trips out, even if it's just like short walks or whatever? Do you ever do short trips that are specifically for you to go out and take photos, or are you still doing it sort of in between doing other things?
Yeah, no, I actually just finished a tiny little social distancing road trip where the goal was just to I really wanted to shoot some new different neon that I've never really seen, and just spend a couple nights on the road, sleeping in the car, with the goal of just working on the photography a little bit, just trying to try a couple different things, tried 3 different cameras, some different films that I've never tried before, just to kind of sharpen those edges a little bit.
Let's just talk about film stocks real quick, because if you're shooting film, I've recently taken up shooting film fairly seriously and learning to develop and so on. What are your sort of go-to film stocks that you enjoy?
I think, like everyone, I'm a fan of Portra 400. I think because there's just a lot of leeway. I have found myself shooting, a stop or 2 stops over and being able to recover highlights and just being so impressed with it. But I've also because of the night photography, I've really gotten into Cinestill 800. I think it's just a really fun film to shoot. I don't absolutely love the red halation, but I think finding a way to shoot it and not blow out those highlights has been really rewarding.
I feel like you can, with the Cinestill, you can use like a Pro Mist filter, and that kills the halations.
Oh my gosh, it's a brilliant idea. I never even thought of that. That would make total sense.
I'd love to take credit for it, but actually a previous podcast guest has a YouTube channel where he shoots film, and I'm pretty sure he brought that up in his video. So I believe that was Grainy Days that actually had that revelation. But yeah, I actually really like the halations. I find it, one thing I do think is that Cinestill is becoming such a popular film. It's actually probably going to define sort of this era of film photography quite a bit more than maybe people realize.
I think you're right. Yeah, it is popping up everywhere. And I think that's great. It'll kind of define the look, which is really cool.
With your cinematography work, if you don't mind me asking, probably another stupid question because of my my lack of knowledge and my ignorance, but you've shot commercial work for the likes of Mountain Dew and Snapchat and other companies, and you've also made music videos. Which one is technically sort of harder to do?
Technically harder would be probably the music videos, just because you're often there's not much money involved, so you're kind of on your own. I might be able to have a first AC, maybe a gaffer to help out, but yeah, usually you're looking at 5 or less people when you're shooting music videos, just by the very nature of the budgets. Those higher end commercials, while the budgets still aren't, you could always use a little more money and you could always use a little more time, but those obviously have a lot more padding and cushioning, especially with brands of that size. There's just a lot more help in order to do it. And then, I talk about this, the flip side and the shadow side, right? Is the shadow side of that is there's people that have a lot of say and really want a certain product at the end of this when you're shooting those commercials. And then music videos, it's a little bit more freeing. Again, it's the creative aspect. There's a lot more autonomy there, which can be really nice and maybe worth the sacrifice of running around and doing everything on your own.
At the risk of making this controversial and pissing off some people, this is the perfect opportunity for me to actually ask about something that I'm very curious about. There was I think it was a TED Talk a few years ago with, who was it with? Joss Whedon, I think. And he talked about the democratization of cinema and motion pictures generally, and that cameras now are a lot more affordable and have a lot more features and more people can afford them. Therefore, more and more filmmakers are popping up with like small budgets, but they're still creating their own thing. Do you think that's potentially a bad thing or a good thing in terms of what's going to end up being sort of created and how hard it's going to be to sieve out the good stuff?
My overall feeling towards it is it's got to be positive. I think anytime when you're leveling the playing field, I think that is always a good thing. Now I can look at specific work and go, okay, I'm not super happy that exists, but I think it's a good thing that people are getting a chance to get their voices out there. Earlier in my career, I DP'd for a director, Michael Peterbon, who I love to death, and he ended up officiating my wedding. He's just such a good friend now. But he used to say all the time, anyone can make a pretty picture. It's really about telling a story. Can you tell a story? And I think that goes to photography as well. Like now with these cameras and, even with an iPhone, you can take an awesome image, but what is the story that you're trying to tell? I think that becomes more interesting. And so I think, yes, let's level the playing field. But I think at the end of the day, people are, good work is awesome. Bad work, boo. But I think what connects with people is a story and a universal theme, and I think that people that maybe wouldn't normally have access to high end cameras are still being able to do something really special with their phones.
Have you ever shot anything like 8mm film and made short movies that way?
Yeah, I bought a 8mm camera in Portland, Oregon, and have been shooting a couple rolls the last couple months. Because things have been quiet here, I haven't sent them out to be developed yet, but I'm hoping they turned out.
Is it a different process in terms of because obviously like film photography compared to digital photography, you have to be so specific and elaborate with what you do because you're so restricted by the number of frames. Whereas I'd feel like 8mm, you're like even more restricted because it's all consecutive. So you could have like a complete run of something going well, and then one thing doesn't work out, and that whole strip becomes. I don't really understand the process. Does the whole strip still? Can you kind of slice and splice stuff together from there? Is that something you'd want to do, or would you try and shoot consecutively and just make sure everything's going right?
Yeah, I think it comes in a cartridge, so there's not a lot of splicing unless you do it on the back end. But okay. Yeah, it's definitely, it feels risky when you're doing it. Then you think about the rest of humanity, and they've been doing it for almost forever. So
yeah.
Very similar to taking, shooting, with the film photo camera. I think I had to let go of those fears and those stresses. And, my my wife is pregnant, and thought, let's just shoot some 8mm and just see how it turns out. Hopefully it turns out. But again, I think it's more forgiving than digital. So I think as long as I'm within a stop or two, I should be fine in terms of exposure. And again, it's like I've got the light meter handy. It's like hanging in the holster right beside me, always just checking things. And I never trust the read on the camera itself. But I also think, you're a photographer too. You kind of, when you're shooting outside, you kind of know, if you're going to be pretty close to exposure, with your readings. So
100%. Is working in feature film something that you are aiming for or would be interested in?
Yeah, that's kind of been the goal all along, is to someday shoot feature films. It's definitely competitive. I've kind of carved out a nice niche here and doing commercial work and some music videos, but I think it's about, meeting the right people, and, it's very catch-22, right? No one's going to just give you a feature to shoot. You have to shoot one first. So I'm always out there trying to meet new directors, and especially young people that, want to shoot a short film, and see if I can get my hands. But that was kind of my big goal for 2020, was to shoot a short film for someone. Obviously things have slowed down quite a bit, but, hoping, within a year to hopefully shoot something. And the state of cinema today is fascinating. Certainly can't shoot a studio film. You need to be in the union, and you work your way up that way. And but independent film, there's still a lot of opportunities there, and that's definitely a goal of mine in the next 5 years, I hope.
Well, I always feel like talking something into existence is a good way to go, because it's like a mindset thing. You can end up kind of pushing yourself in a direction subconsciously. So let's do that now. Who's the director that you'd most like to work with on a feature film?
You know what? We don't know their name yet, but they really believe in telling honest stories. They love movies, and you can see it in the way that they write. And they've got something to say that the world needs to hear. So that's the director I want to shoot for. I don't know who they are yet.
Are there any genres that you would avoid? Because I say, for the sake of transparency, and you can feel free to mock this, but I'm a lifelong horror fan. I've always liked horror films. Generally speaking, the great thing about horror films for me is that when they're good, they're great, and when they're bad, they're hilarious. Whereas I don't think any other film category kind of falls into that. So you're always going to get something out of it. Is there any genres that you would not want to work in?
Yeah, no, I love horror. I think you're absolutely right. When it's done well, people try to disqualify and say it's not horror. You have like a movie like Get Out, and they're like, it's a thriller. It's a horror movie, and it's awesome. But no, I don't know if there's anything off. I guess I don't know if there's anything off limits. I probably wouldn't want to do a huge CGI based film. I don't. I've shot some green screen stuff. I don't hate it, but I prefer a little bit grittier, more realistic looking locations and things like that.
I can't imagine it's fun to just stand in front of a green screen all day. To me, that sounds like honestly the most mind-numbing thing in the world. And I generally speaking can't stand heavy CGI films, because I don't know if I've just got some kind of really forward-thinking brain, but I know what's going to look bad in 5 years now. And I'm watching some films and I'm like, yeah, this is clearly CGI. And anyone that thinks that this looks good as CGI, they're missing the point that they can still tell it's CGI. So it's still pulling you out of the film, Maybe I'm just being whiny.
No, I totally agree. I think, if you're noticing it now, it's not going to age well.
No. It's been absolutely wonderful to talk to you. And I understand you're having a much better weather day than we're having here in England. So I've tried to curb my spitefulness towards you throughout the podcast. What we always have to do with the podcast is to make sure people know where to. In fact, you know what? I'm going to jump into something before then because I really like this question and I have no idea where a cinematographer is going to go with it. I like to ask one broad question. And that broad question is, what is your worst habit as a cinematographer?
Worst habit as a cinematographer. Oh man. I don't know if this would be a habit. This is something that habitually happens is I get so worked up and nervous the night before a shoot that I inevitably don't sleep. And I think let me say this. I think that it's okay to be nervous about a shoot. I think that means that you care. Right. I think though it's unhealthy when you do it every time and you don't sleep. I think that, so I guess my bad habit would be really trying to figure out that balance between life and work. I think that I need to work on. And I feel like I've been sleeping really well through quarantine. So maybe that will bleed over once this ends.
Is it nerves as in excited to get going with the project, or is it nerves as in you worrying about like what you're going to end up doing?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I think there's a little bit of imposter syndrome there. Thinking like everyone's going to figure out that I don't belong on this set tomorrow. I think that's a big fear that I wrestle with, and yeah, I think also with the job title comes a lot of responsibility and fearing or worrying that I won't be able to deliver on in the moment. Can definitely keeps me up at night for sure.
The most important part of the podcast is that people know where they can go to find your work. So I know you have a website for your cinematography. I want to make sure people know where they can go to see. I think it's just a trailer at the moment for Las Vegas Bender. But where can everyone find what you do?
Yeah, thanks. It's DannyCorey.com. Corey is spelled Corey. And from there, you'll find all the links, the Vimeo link, the Instagram, all that good stuff.
It's been so good to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a delight. And I've definitely become a fan of the podcast after listening the last few days. So appreciate it.